Agent Nina Carter, a dedicated 35-year-old FBI investigator, started her day like any other with a refreshing early morning jog. The quiet suburban park on the outskirts of Atlanta was her sanctuary, a place to escape the high-stress nature of her job. As the sun began to rise, casting a soft glow through the trees, Nina laced up her shoes, blissfully unaware of the unexpected confrontation that lay ahead. The crisp morning air filled her lungs as she settled into her pace, her mind slowly unwinding from the week's stress. Suddenly, a harsh voice pierced the tranquil morning. "Hey, you!" The tone was commanding, demanding her attention. Nina stopped in her tracks, turning her head to see Officer Blake Grayson, a tall and broad-shouldered cop, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the first glints of sunlight. "What are you doing here?" he barked, his words clipped and filled with suspicion as he marched toward her. Grayson was notorious for his abrasive manner, a reputation that preceded him in the local community. Nina paused, genuinely confused by the hostility. "I'm jogging," she replied evenly, her expression neutral. She had run through this park countless times without issue. Grayson's eyes narrowed behind his dark lenses. "This park has had reports of suspicious activity. You match the description." His tone carried an edge of accusation that she recognized all too well, the familiar sting of unjust suspicion. Nina took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "Suspicious activity? I'm just exercising. Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice steady but challenging. It was clear to her that this wasn't about suspicious activity. This was profiling, plain and simple. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped, his jaw clenching. "ID now." His tone left no room for argument, but Nina had been in far too many situations like this to back down easily. Instead of complying, Nina pulled out her phone. "I'll record this, thanks," she said, her voice even, her resolve unwavering. She had seen firsthand how these encounters could spiral out of control, and she wasn't about to let that happen without evidence. The move seemed to infuriate Grayson. Without hesitation, he smacked the phone out of her hand. It fell to the ground with a harsh clatter, the screen cracking as it landed. A few early morning walkers had stopped, their eyes wide, watching the scene unfold with a mix of curiosity and unease. "You think you can disrespect me?" Grayson growled, stepping closer, his imposing figure towering over her, his hand shifting to rest menacingly on his baton. His ego was clearly bruised, and he was ready to assert his authority, whether it was right or wrong. Nina didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her eyes locking onto his, her voice calm and measured. "I think you're making a mistake, officer." Her words, though simple, carried weight, and something in her gaze made Grayson pause, if only for a moment. The silence between them stretched, the tension palpable. The small group of onlookers watched, their eyes darting between Nina and Grayson. The officer was visibly struggling to maintain control of the situation, a situation that had quickly spiraled far beyond a simple question. "You don't belong here," he muttered, his voice barely audible but dripping with prejudice. Nina knew that tone well. It was the sound of unchecked power, of entitlement that had gone unchallenged for too long. With a calmness that belied her growing anger, Nina looked Grayson directly in the eyes. "This is a public park," she said, her voice firm. "I have every right to be here, just like anyone else." Grayson's face twisted in anger, his hand tightening on his baton. The crowd, now growing, held their breath, the air thick with anticipation. It was then that Nina knew she had to escalate in her own way, not with aggression, but with authority. Slowly, she reached into her pocket, making sure her movements were deliberate. Grayson's eyes followed her hand, his stance tensing as if ready for a fight. But instead of resistance, Nina pulled out her badge, flipping it open for him and everyone else to see. "Special Agent Nina Carter, FBI," she stated, her voice ringing with authority. The sudden shift was like a shockwave through the small crowd. Murmurs rippled, and Grayson's face visibly paled, his confidence faltering as he stared at the badge. For a long moment, Grayson said nothing, his expression a mix of disbelief and something akin to fear. The tables had turned, and he knew it. He glanced at the badge, then back at her face, the realization slowly dawning on him. Nina stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "Now, Officer Grayson, would you like to explain why you felt it necessary to harass an innocent person this morning?" she asked, her tone icy. Grayson opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He seemed to deflate, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of his mistake. The crowd watched in stunned silence, phones now raised, capturing every moment of the officer's downfall. Just then, the distant wail of a police siren grew louder, and a cruiser pulled up to the edge of the park. Captain Maria Alvarez stepped out, her sharp eyes scanning the scene before zeroing in on Nina and Grayson. "Agent Carter," Alvarez greeted, her voice holding a note of surprise as she approached. She glanced at Grayson, her eyes narrowing. "What's going on here?" Nina didn't hesitate. "Just a case of an officer overstepping his bounds, Captain," she said, her eyes still locked on Grayson. Alvarez turned to Grayson, her expression unreadable. "Officer Grayson, hand over your badge and weapon. We'll be sorting this out at the precinct." Grayson looked as if he might protest, but the look in Alvarez's eyes silenced him. Slowly, he unclipped his badge, handing it over without a word. The once proud and imposing officer now stood small, his authority stripped away in the blink of an eye. Nina watched as Grayson was escorted away, her heart pounding in her chest. This was only the beginning, she knew. Today, she had stood her ground, but the fight for real change was far from over. Grayson's arrogance reached a boiling point as he raised his hand, ready to intimidate Nina further. But she moved with precision, grabbing his wrist midair. The crowd gasped as she effortlessly twisted his arm, forcing him to stumble backward, his bravado crumbling in an instant. "What the hell?" he stammered, his confidence visibly faltering. Grayson had never expected this. Someone standing up to him, let alone in such a calm, controlled manner. Nina didn't miss a beat. With an air of authority, she reached into her jacket pocket and calmly pulled out her badge, holding it up for the growing crowd to see. The polished gold of the FBI emblem glinted in the morning sun, capturing everyone's attention. "I'm Special Agent Nina Carter with the FBI," she stated, her voice steady and firm. "And you've just assaulted a federal agent." Grayson's face drained of color. His arrogance turned into uncertainty as he tried to comprehend what was happening. This can't be real," he muttered, shaking his head as though denying the reality before him. Murmurs of astonishment rippled through the crowd, many of whom were now holding up their phones, recording every moment of the drama unfolding before them. The tables had indeed turned, and Grayson knew he had lost control of the situation. "It's very real," Nina responded, her gaze unwavering. "And I'll make sure your behavior is well documented. People need to see exactly what happened here today." Grayson's hand hovered over his radio, a flicker of defiance still lingering in his eyes. "You think you're untouchable?" he spat, his voice trembling with a combination of fear and fury. He wasn't ready to concede, at least not yet. Nina's gaze remained unflinching. "Untouchable? No," she said. "Accountable? Absolutely. You, however, seem to think that badge gives you the right to harass innocent people. That ends today." The air was thick with tension as Grayson's defiance began to crumble. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, their silent judgment weighing heavily. He was no longer the one in control. That power had shifted entirely to Nina. Just then, the blare of a police siren grew louder, drawing closer until a black and white cruiser pulled up to the edge of the park. The crowd parted as the car door opened, and out stepped Captain Maria Alvarez, her sharp eyes assessing the situation with the experience of a seasoned officer. Alvarez moved swiftly, her posture commanding respect. She approached Nina, recognition flashing across her face. "Agent Carter," she greeted, her voice professional, though there was a hint of surprise in her eyes. Nina nodded. "Captain Alvarez," she replied, keeping her eyes on Grayson. She gestured subtly toward the officer, whose face was now flushed a deep shade of red, his earlier aggression having morphed into embarrassment and fear. Alvarez turned to Grayson, her tone cold and exacting. "Officer Grayson, what's going on here?" she demanded. Grayson opened his mouth, His voice caught somewhere between an excuse and a protest, but Alvarez silenced him with a wave of her hand. "Enough," she said firmly. Her gaze was like ice, and there was no mistaking the severity of her words. "Hand over your badge and weapon. We'll sort this out at the precinct." Grayson hesitated, his pride warring with the undeniable reality of his situation. Slowly, he reached up, unclipping his badge, his hand shaking as he handed it over. The once proud officer now stood deflated, his authority stripped away in the space of mere minutes. Alvarez took the badge without a word, her expression unchanged. Nina watched, her heart pounding in her chest. This was more than just about her. It was about setting a precedent. She wanted Grayson to understand that there were consequences, that abusing authority was not something that would go unnoticed or unpunished. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder as Alvarez turned to Nina, her demeanor softening slightly. "Agent Carter, we'll need your statement," she said, glancing at the onlookers. "Preferably somewhere more private." Nina nodded, glancing back at the small crowd. "Of course, Captain," she said, before turning her attention back to Grayson. "I hope you understand, officer, that this isn't over." Grayson, still too stunned to speak, simply nodded, his eyes cast downward. The fight had left him, and he now stood as nothing more than a shadow of the bully who had tried to intimidate her just minutes earlier. Alvarez gestured toward her cruiser, and Grayson was led away, his head hanging low as the weight of his actions bore down on him. The crowd began to disperse, people murmuring amongst themselves, their eyes lingering on Nina with a mix of admiration and curiosity. Nina took a deep breath, the adrenaline slowly beginning to ebb away. She bent down to pick up her phone, inspecting the cracked screen. It was damaged, but it still worked, and that was all she needed. She looked up, meeting the eyes of a few of the onlookers who had stayed behind. One woman, holding a toddler on her hip, stepped forward. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes filled with gratitude. "For standing up to him." Nina offered a small smile, her heart warming at the words. "I'm just doing what anyone should do," she replied, slipping her phone back into her pocket. "No one should have to deal with that." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening. "Still, thank you. It means a lot to see someone stand their ground." Nina gave a final nod before turning to follow Alvarez, who was waiting by her cruiser. As she walked, she felt the weight of what had happened beginning to settle in her chest. This was only the beginning, a small step in a much larger fight for accountability and justice. But it was a step she was willing to take, no matter how many obstacles stood in her way. Alvarez drove Nina to the precinct in silence. The captain was clearly processing what had happened, her eyes occasionally flickering toward Nina in the rearview mirror. When they finally arrived, Alvarez led Nina to an office, gesturing for her to sit. "Agent Carter," Alvarez began, her voice carefully measured. "I want you to know that what happened today will not be swept under the rug. Officer Grayson has been a problem for a while, and this might be the push we need to finally deal with him properly." Nina met her gaze, her expression serious. "I appreciate that, Captain, but I'm not just interested in Grayson. This is about the bigger picture, about ensuring that officers like him don't get the chance to misuse their power in the first place." Alvarez nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "You're right," she admitted. "This isn't just about one officer. It's about a culture that allows this kind of behavior to thrive. We need systemic change." Nina leaned forward, her determination evident. "And I want to help make that change happen, whatever it takes." For the first time since she had arrived at the precinct, Alvarez allowed herself a small smile. "I was hoping you'd say that. We could use someone like you, someone who isn't afraid to speak up and demand accountability." Nina returned the smile, a sense of purpose filling her chest. This was why she had joined the FBI, not just to enforce the law, but to ensure that justice was upheld for everyone, regardless of who they were or where they came from. "Let's get to work," Nina said, her voice resolute. And with that, she knew that today was only the beginning of a much larger journey, one that she was ready to take on, no matter the cost. At the police station, Nina sat in the stark, cold-walled interrogation room, recounting the incident to Captain Alvarez and other senior officials. Her voice was calm, but her words carried the weight of both frustration and resolve. Across the precinct, in a separate room, Blake Grayson sat alone. The arrogance that had once defined him had evaporated, replaced now with palpable fear. He knew the evidence against him was overwhelming, and his career, the badge he had so often misused, hung by a thread. As Nina described every detail of the confrontation, she made sure not to focus solely on her own experience. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice unwavering. "It's about a pattern of abuse that people like Grayson perpetuate. If we don't address this now, it'll keep happening. And it's not just him. It's a systemic issue that goes unchecked." Captain Alvarez nodded, her eyes focused and serious. "You're absolutely right. And trust me, Agent Carter, this department will take action." She exchanged glances with the other officials in the room, their faces a mix of shame and determination. In the days that followed, the story of the incident spread like wildfire. Videos of the confrontation circulated on social media, amassing thousands of views and sparking outrage nationwide. Citizens, activists, and even public officials joined the call for justice, demanding a response from the department. Grayson's history of misconduct began to surface, multiple complaints from citizens who had experienced his overreach but had been too intimidated to push for accountability. This time, however, things were different. Under mounting pressure, the police department launched an internal investigation. Officer Grayson was suspended without pay, pending a disciplinary hearing. The department's leadership publicly vowed transparency, promising to address not only Grayson's behavior, but also the broader issue of bias and abuse of power among its ranks. For Nina, it wasn't just about the punishment of one officer. It was about ensuring real change took root. She knew that Grayson was not the sole issue. He was a symptom of a much larger problem. Sitting in Captain Alvarez's office one morning, Nina outlined her perspective. "I don't want this to end with Grayson being disciplined," she said, her tone firm. "I want systemic reform. Policies that prevent people like him from abusing their power need to be implemented. Without that, we're just playing whack-a-mole with these issues." Alvarez listened intently, her expression thoughtful. She nodded slowly. "You're right. The culture needs to change. We can start with mandatory training, but that's only a piece of it. We need oversight. We need independent review boards." She trailed off, her mind clearly working through the possibilities. After a moment, Alvarez looked directly at Nina, a spark of determination in her eyes. "How would you feel about working with us on a task force to address bias and to bring about the kind of changes we need?" Nina blinked, a bit surprised by the offer. But then she smiled, her resolve hardening. "I'd be honored, Captain. Whatever it takes to make sure this kind of abuse ends, I'm in." The task force was formed within weeks, composed of a mix of officers, community leaders, and legal experts. Nina was front and center, using her position and her voice to push for real, tangible reforms. It wasn't easy. There was resistance, especially from older members of the force who viewed these efforts as an attack on their way of doing things. But Nina wasn't deterred. She understood that change was uncomfortable, but it was also necessary. Meanwhile, the disciplinary hearing for Grayson approached. The atmosphere at the precinct was tense, with everyone aware that this was a pivotal moment not just for Grayson, but for the department's reputation as well. The hearing was held in a packed room, with both officers and members of the community present. Grayson's face was drawn, his demeanor no longer brash and arrogant, but rather nervous, as he faced the panel of officials. Nina attended the hearing, sitting in the back with Alvarez by her side. As she watched, she felt a mix of emotions, anger at what had happened, but also a hope that maybe, just maybe, this was a step toward something better. The evidence against Grayson was overwhelming, from Nina's testimony to the damning footage captured by onlookers. He attempted to apologize, his voice cracking, but it was clear that his words were not enough to undo the damage he had caused. When the panel returned with their decision, there was a heavy silence in the room. Grayson was found guilty of misconduct and stripped of his badge. The consequences were severe. His career in law enforcement was over. As the decision was read, Grayson sat still, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. There was no applause, no satisfaction from those in the room. Only the quiet, collective acknowledgement that justice, in this instance, had been served. But for Nina, it wasn't about celebrating a fall. It was about what came next. Following the hearing, Alvarez called a press conference. Standing before a podium, she addressed the gathered reporters. Today, our department took a necessary step in holding one of our own accountable for his actions. But this is just the beginning. We are committed to making the changes needed to ensure that all members of our community are treated with respect and dignity, regardless of who they are. Nina stood to the side, watching as Alvarez spoke with conviction. She knew the captain meant every word. It wasn't going to be easy. The path to real change never was. But there was a sense of hope, a sense that things could be different if they kept pushing. In the weeks that followed, the task force began rolling out new initiatives. Body cameras were mandated for all officers, and a new, independent oversight committee was formed to handle complaints against the police. Training sessions were revamped, focusing not just on de-escalation techniques, but also on recognizing and addressing implicit bias. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. One day, after a long meeting, Nina and Alvarez walked out of the precinct together. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the parking lot. Alvarez glanced at Nina, her expression thoughtful. "You know, when you first stood up to Grayson, I wasn't sure how this would all play out," she admitted. "But I'm glad you did. It forced us to look in the mirror, to see what we've been ignoring for too long." Nina smiled, her heart swelling with a sense of purpose. "We're not done yet," she said, "but I'm glad we're moving in the right direction. One step at a time." Alvarez nodded. One step at a time. As they stood there, the weight of the work ahead of them still pressing down, there was also a sense of optimism. Change was happening, and they were both part of it. And that, for Nina, was worth every struggle, every confrontation, and every challenge that lay ahead. This was what justice looked like. Slow, sometimes painful, but always worth fighting for. Grayson's disciplinary hearing was a pivotal moment, one that would decide not only his future but also serve as a litmus test for the department's commitment to reform. Facing a room filled with colleagues, community members, and Nina herself, Grayson stood at the front, no longer the towering figure of authority he once portrayed, but a man stripped of his power, vulnerable for the first time. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. He glanced around the room, his gaze meeting those he had wronged. "I let my biases cloud my judgment. And for that, I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, and the room remained silent for a moment before murmurs began to ripple through. His apology was met with mixed reactions. Some of the community members looked at him with skepticism, others with empathy. To them, it could be genuine remorse, or perhaps it was just desperation. But for Nina, it was a beginning. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on Grayson. "Accountability is the first step," she said aloud, her voice clear. "The next is action." Grayson nodded, his expression pained but resolute. He knew that words alone would not be enough. As part of his sentence, the department mandated that he attend extensive counseling sessions and participate in community outreach programs. It wasn't an easy pill for him to swallow, but deep down, Grayson knew that these were the only steps that could bring any semblance of redemption. Over the next few months, Grayson's world transformed. His days, once filled with the authority of a uniform, were now occupied by uncomfortable conversations and humbling experiences. He was required to meet with the very communities he had wronged, sitting in town halls, listening as people recounted their experiences with law enforcement. The stories weren't always directly about him, but each tale of fear, mistrust, and pain felt like a mirror, reflecting his actions and their consequences. At first, the community was wary of him, rightfully so. When he walked into the community center for the first time, a murmur swept through the room. Eyes followed him, filled with caution and a hint of anger. Grayson could feel their judgment, the weight of his past actions bearing down on him. He had been the symbol of their fears, and now he was expected to be different. One meeting stood out to him more than the others. An elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson spoke about her grandson's fear of the police, recounting how he would cross the street whenever he saw a patrol car. "He shouldn't have to be afraid of the people meant to protect him," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Grayson could only nod, the guilt and realization washing over him in waves. He had never thought of the impact his actions had on children, on families. And here it was, laid bare before him. Despite the hostility, Grayson showed up, week after week. He listened, and slowly, the community began to see something they hadn't expected: change. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't grand, but it was there. Grayson started to speak less from defensiveness and more from understanding. He apologized, not just once, but repeatedly, for the ways he and his peers had let people down. And each time, it became less about saving his career and more about genuinely wanting to make amends. The counseling sessions were another cornerstone of his transformation. His counselor, Dr. Elaine Harris, was unrelenting in her questioning, probing not just his actions but the reasons behind them. "Why did you feel the need to assert dominance in that moment?" she asked during one session. Grayson was silent for a long time, staring at the floor. Finally, he spoke, his voice strained. "Because I thought I had to. I thought that's what made me a good cop. Authority. Control." Dr. Harris nodded, her expression softening. "But real authority comes from respect, not fear. You understand that now?" He met her eyes, nodding. "I'm beginning to." Meanwhile, Nina and Captain Alvarez's task force worked tirelessly to implement the reforms they had outlined. It was a daunting task, one that required changing entrenched mindsets and battling resistance from within the department. But they pressed on, motivated by the belief that things could be different. The training programs were revamped, focusing heavily on de-escalation, community engagement, and implicit bias. Officers were required to attend workshops led by community members, where they had to listen, truly listen, to the impact their actions had on the people they were sworn to protect. The independent oversight committees were established, and the safe spaces for citizens to report misconduct without fear of retaliation were put into place. Nina often found herself reflecting on the work they were doing. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling meeting, she sat with Alvarez in the precinct's break room. "Do you think it's enough?" she asked, her voice tired but hopeful. Alvarez took a sip of her coffee, her eyes thoughtful. "It's a start. Culture doesn't change overnight. But I think, with persistence, we're laying the foundation for something better." Nina nodded, allowing herself a small smile. One step at a time. The true turning point for Grayson came during a community event, a few months into his outreach program. He was helping set up tables when a young boy approached him, his eyes wide with curiosity. Grayson recognized the boy as Mrs. Thompson's grandson. The boy stared at him for a moment before finally speaking. "Are you the police officer who hurt people?" The question caught Grayson off guard. He knelt to meet the boy's eye level, his heart heavy. "Yes," he said honestly. "I made some bad choices. I hurt people, and I'm really sorry for that." The boy studied him, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. After what felt like an eternity, the boy nodded and held out his hand. Grayson took it, a lump forming in his throat. It was a small gesture, but it was everything to him. It was hope. As months turned into a year, the changes became more evident. The community, once distrustful, began to open up. They attended meetings, voiced their concerns, and even started to build relationships with the officers who had once seemed so distant. Grayson, now no longer an officer but a community liaison, played a significant role in bridging that gap. He used his story as a cautionary tale, speaking at forums about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of empathy in policing. Nina watched Grayson from afar, witnessing his slow, steady transformation. She knew he still had a long way to go, but the progress he had made was undeniable. Redemption, she realized, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about facing it, learning from it, and doing better moving forward. At a community town hall, Grayson stood beside Nina and Alvarez as they discussed the progress of the task force. He spoke last, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I know I'm not the person I used to be. I've learned that respect is earned through actions, not demanded through fear. I'm here today because I want to make things right, not just for myself, but for everyone I've hurt." The room was silent for a moment before a round of applause broke out. It wasn't unanimous, but it was real. And for Grayson, it was more than he could have hoped for. Nina felt a sense of satisfaction as she listened to him speak. This was what she had wanted. Not just punishment, but change. And it was happening, slowly but surely. She turned to Alvarez, who gave her a nod of approval. "We're on the right track," Alvarez said quietly. Nina smiled. "Yes, we are." The journey was far from over, but they were making strides. Grayson's redemption was just one piece of the larger puzzle, but it was proof that change was possible, even for those who had once been part of the problem. And that, for Nina, was worth every moment of struggle and every step toward a more just world. Months later, Nina and Grayson crossed paths again at a community event. The warm, late afternoon sun bathed the park in a golden glow, casting long shadows as community members gathered for an event celebrating progress in local policing. Grayson stood at the front, speaking to the crowd with a calm confidence that hadn't been there before. "I used to think the badge made me untouchable," he admitted, his voice carrying across the lawn. "But I've learned that true strength comes from humility and accountability. Change is hard, but it's necessary." The crowd listened intently, some nodding in agreement, others still skeptical but willing to give him a chance. Grayson's transformation had not been perfect, and the scars from his past mistakes remained. But today, he stood here as someone committed to being better, not just for himself, but for the community he had once wronged. Nina watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with cautious hope. She had seen the difficult journey Grayson had undertaken. From the arrogance of a man who misused his power to someone willing to face the consequences of his actions and strive for something better. His journey was far from over, but this moment was proof that change, though slow, was possible. As the event drew to a close, people dispersed, chatting among themselves, sharing smiles, and connecting in a way that felt different, more open, more hopeful. Grayson approached Nina, his expression earnest, gratitude evident in his eyes. "Agent Carter," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you. Thank you for holding me accountable. You've shown me what true leadership looks like, and I'll never forget that." Nina shook his hand, a warm smile spreading across her face. "The real work is just beginning, Grayson," she replied. "Don't stop now. People are watching, and they need to see that this wasn't just a phase, that real change is happening." Grayson nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "I know. I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. Their handshake was more than just a greeting or a farewell. It was an unspoken pact, a shared understanding that they were on the same side now. It marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where justice and empathy could coexist, where authority was wielded with compassion, and where the community's voice was heard and respected. As they parted ways, Nina watched Grayson walk back towards a group of children who were gathered near a table, curious about the activities he had helped organize. He knelt to talk to them, his posture relaxed, his demeanor kind. She could see the way they responded to him, some still hesitant, others more trusting, but all of them curious. A sense of quiet fulfillment settled over Nina. This was what she had fought for. Not just consequences for wrongdoing, but the possibility of transformation. She looked around the park, families enjoying the day, officers mingling with citizens, conversations filled with laughter and understanding, and felt a deep sense of purpose. The work wasn't done, and it never would be. But seeing moments like this, seeing Grayson's genuine efforts and the community's response, filled her with the belief that they were moving in the right direction. And that, for Nina, was enough to keep going. She turned, heading toward Captain Alvarez, who was standing near the refreshments table, talking to a group of community leaders. As Nina approached, Alvarez caught her eye and smiled, lifting her cup in a silent toast. Nina returned the smile, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. Change was hard. It was slow. But today, in this park, surrounded by the people they served, Nina knew they were making it happen. One step, one conversation, one person at a time. This story isn't just about Nina and Grayson. It's a testament to the power of accountability, the possibility of redemption, and the strength found in community. Nina's courage to stand against injustice ignited a ripple effect that led to real, meaningful change. Grayson's journey from arrogance to advocacy shows us that growth is achievable, even for those who have lost their way. Change begins with difficult conversations, honest reflection, and unwavering resolve. It requires individuals to take a stand, to be brave enough to confront uncomfortable truths, and to act even when the path seems uncertain. Nina and Grayson's story reminds us that justice is not just about punishment. It is about transformation, compassion, and the courage to be better. Let this story inspire us to challenge prejudice, demand accountability, and create spaces for healing and understanding. True strength lies in the willingness to grow, to admit mistakes, and to work tirelessly for a world where fairness prevails. Together, we can build a future where justice and empathy walk hand in hand, ensuring that every voice is heard and every person is treated with the dignity they deserve.